main office, I guess.
So then we would touch base with you as soon as we have sorted things out.
Sure.
Marielle, you have a comment that is very concerning?
Yes, in response to the comment about from Chris Malinsky that Fish and Wildlife Service apparently is also cracking down on issuing blanket permits for migratory birds. And this is a major issue for our institution, if this is the case.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. I don't know if this is sort of a overall Fish and Wildlife Service permitting issue where they're cracking down on all these various permits, but yeah, it appears they're possibly going to be getting rid of the use of blanket permits for import-export for migratory birds, which is basically every bird in the U.S.
Is that linked with potentially infectious diseases that could be carried by those bird samples, or is that because of protection of?
The USDA has permits for dealing with transport of birds, and they have exemptions for museum specimens for research. And it sounds like this is Fish and Wildlife Service that is cracking down. So I don't think doesn't sound like disease related.
Mm-hmm. But would it then be a good idea, like Adam organized that during the Spinach conference in Chicago, to have some sort of meeting with people to exchange face to face? I think in the past, at least here on the European side, that was always very helpful if you meet the people in person, if that is possible, or in the virtual space to discuss the issue. And who would be then, Chris, do you know any contact points? Because from what I observed from the discussion so far, people are concerned. There is a lot of discussion, but the question is who do we want to reach? So who is our contact?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's so many issues we have right now with Fish and Wildlife Service, from marine mammal to migratory birds to eDNA and all those other things. Those are all Fish and Wildlife Service issues. So there needs to be, I think, some high-level meetings with Fish and Wildlife, and I know our institution is going to be trying to engage with them on some of those. But I'm not sure who we would want to invite if we wanted to have this sort of similar meeting that we had in Chicago, I guess it was, with like the CDC. I think we had a meeting about permitting and bats and that sort of thing. If we could have that a similar meeting with Fish and Wildlife Service at a future Spinach meeting, that would be great. But I'm not sure at this point who we would want to contact or who we would invite. But it's something we have a couple of years maybe there. When's the next in-person Spinach meeting? Is that going to be next year?
Yeah, Diane, you have your hand raised. No. Okay.
Yeah, the next meeting will be 2022 in Scotland.
Yeah, we may not get Fish and Wildlife go to Scotland, but so the next U.S. meeting would be the time to do that, which is still a couple of years away. But.
It could also be a smaller meeting, an informal meeting, which was very helpful. So when I see Peter there, we had that when we did the shipping workshop back in old days in Bonn. So we invited the people from our ministries and also parcel carriers. And that was very helpful, actually. So because you had them sitting all at one table and exchange and discuss the problems there. And as far as I understood from what Adam told, that was very useful also during the meeting in Chicago. So this is why I was thinking maybe that would be an opportunity first to try to have an informal exchange, because that is not so high ranking as an official request. So simply to understand the landscape a little bit better and where those people have their specific problems, because usually these regulators are either lawyers, which have an entirely different understanding from nature, to put it broad. And so, but we would need some people from the US that take a lead for such a meeting. So I can surely assist in preparing that. But if you would meet in the US, it would be good, because you are immediately affected by that, to have at least 1 or 2 people taking a lead during that meeting or discussion. So there is a lot of, just open your mic. It's a little bit difficult to follow the chat. So might be better to have a direct exchange rather than put everything into the chat. So Greg,
Yeah, so we just had an iDig Bio workshop on bridging the gap between zoos and museums, and Adam gave his talk on the trials and tribulations of marine mammal transfer. And yesterday we met as a steering committee to talk about maybe meeting in person now that that might be possible. And if we do, it would be in the fall, and we would like to bring at least one of those fish and wildlife people to the party and sort of talk about this and figure out, you know, do they not understand what we are, or what?
It could actually be the case, so that they understand that as a museum rather than as a research institute. So this is why my question was earlier in the smaller group, if there would be any examples, and preferably from institutions within the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, which have both sides, so museum and research institute, because that could be a good role made to explain to them, well, look, the official title is museum, but what they do is actually research. And so that might help to bridge the gap there. Or if there would be any other US law that would state actually that museums are recognized as research institutes. But I have no clue on pertaining US laws that could be relevant in that area, so some sort of screening might be helpful.
And I think Andy's right there, because museums do get certificate of scientific exchange recognition. So Fish and Wildlife does recognize that we're scientific exchangers.
Yeah, and it might be worth to link that back to those people that have problems in understanding that. So it is always very useful to show them, well, your own folks in the other department have an entirely different understanding of what's going on. So where is your problem now? Might be worth discussing that. Of course, you would phrase that more diplomatic. But actually, it as we discussed last week, it seems to be rather a personal problem with a different perspective on what museums are. And we face that in different countries. Shelley is basically agree. So we have that all over the place. And I think that's the major challenge here. Okay, Greg, could you draft or screen some connecting points and bounce that back via email at some point?
Sure.
So that we maybe we can meet next week. I think Adam has more time next week, so that we could perhaps wrap that up and come up with a plan.
Sure.
How to move that forward. And anyone who is interested to follow up, feel invited. I think Chris, if you want to join that too, just maybe send out an email that we don't overlook you, to have you on board, and then we try to find a way forward on that point. Is there any more concerns or things you would like to raise for that point? No? Okay, then let's move on to the next one, and that's also a US Fish and Wildlife issue, and eDNA. And I think I try to briefly wrap that up. So there is an issue with eDNA samples that are imported. And that might be a general condition because at the point of import, it is just water. So it is basically unclear what is included in that sample in terms of species, if they will be protected or not. And I think you could transfer that also to soil samples, which might have similar issues there. Things get funny once you try to analyze that sample and come up with species that are included, and species does not mean necessarily that the specimen, so the species itself, is included there, but a trace of that species that is recognizable, so a DNA trace actually. And if protected species are included, that might cause issues, for example, if CITES species are included, because then you would have the situation that you have imported samples without proper CITES paperwork. And if that is going to be published, that might create issues. Because once that is published, you create a visibility. And as far as we know from other areas, countries are increasingly starting to screen publications for violations with permits, access laws, and all sorts of things. So the question is how that can be handled, and surely that is not only a question for imports of eDNA samples to the US. And we have been discussing that in the smaller group in the past. And there might be connecting points with Canadian law. I don't know. I see Bill is there. Bill, have you heard anything from the Canadian side, or do you know any laws that would be relevant? Any Canadian laws that could connect there?
I'm still working on that. Went to 5 different people, and then that email just went silent.
That's also kind of answer. Okay.
It's kind of they were saying, "Oh, that's a good question." So yeah,
it's always good to raise clever questions. But they don't have any regulations in place currently that cover that occasion. So there's nothing in place that they would immediately bounce back to you on eDNA.
Not necessarily. They just didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that will be an issue also for the monitoring that should be carried out within the post-2020 global biodiversity monitoring scheme in near future, because that surely will require a lot of exchange of such environmental samples, and it might be worth to address that issue. How should we move that forward? As far as I know, some try to reach out to Fish and Wildlife and NOAA to gather some information on the issue. But as far as I know, we don't have any concrete information.
I think I assume that Bill and Jeff have been briefing you on our eDNA subcommittee here at Smithsonian. But the current state of things is that we're moving very slowly as a group to get clarification from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So we've had, internal deliberations about with our team as to whether this stuff is regulated or not. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of these questions are still very much up in the air, even internally.
Do you have some sort of document where all that information is wrapped up?
Not currently. We have a working document that still is kind of behind the firewall. And that document is intended to kind of churn its way through the various levels of SI and different interagency working groups.
But you have compiled something that you use internally, which is a good starting point.
We really don't. There's no, as I mentioned, we have this kind of initial kind of interpretation of law, but that is just a single thing. I don't think it's anything that we're hanging our hat on at this point, at least at the collection staff level.
So then it would be a good starting point to gather information, wouldn't it? So perhaps we can come up with a smaller group that would be interested in that topic. And I think the first useful step might be to understand where we are with the issue at the moment. So I know that might not only be an issue inside the US, because I think eDNA samples will raise questions also in other countries. And so I think it might be worth to compile information on what an eDNA sample might be and could include, and how this is currently handled. So how do we receive eDNA samples at the moment, so that we have some sort of exchange and see how in different institutions eDNA samples are handled?
We certainly do have, we have a PowerPoint that we can share with this group that kind of summarizes the major issues. And I've shared this with a few of the people on this call, but it certainly outlines the fact that we are dealing with eDNA on a very much kind of ad hoc basis.
Yeah.
So, for each import, it's basically, is this okay? We're trying to be very transparent in what we're doing now. With the thought that things are so in flux of different understanding the different ports, that we're trying to make sure we have our due diligence in place to cover ourselves.
It might be worth identifying how such questions are handled. I do know from the European law, from the guidance documents that have been developed for Nagoya, for example, that in that guidance document, the handling of environmental samples is covered. So at least there is some sort of opinion, some sort of legal opinion, what such a sample could be. and what is done with such kind of samples. And when talking to lawyers, they always appreciate some sort of legal opinion that is already out there in that space, because then they could connect with their rationale to that opinion that has already been issued. And so I think when we start now to collect information, and then we can see if or which kinds of interpretations are already available for such material, and then we would have some sort of common ground and knowledge base, and can compare what is there, how it is handled in different institutions, and then we can develop a strategy out of that. Because at the moment, my impression is everyone is slightly concerned. There is an open landscape which nobody entirely understands, and we don't know how regulators actually want to deal with the issue. So I think the good starting point would be if we have an own opinion on that, that would have some broad consensus among different institutions. Because we have to consider that this sort of material is not only imported to one specific country, but exchanged globally. So there might be more than one issue or more than one issue in one country. And so if we develop a strategy or some sort of information how that could be handled, that might be helpful in more than one places. So who would like to join that group?
I'm happy. I'm already knee deep in the subject, so.
I would be interested, says Mariel Campbell.
Dirk, I kind of think that some sort of MOU, maybe institutionally with Fish and Wildlife Service, would be the best route. In at least our institution, that model has not gotten any traction, but I think at least the regulatory bodies know that this is not take of samples, but more of detective samples. And all what they would really appreciate is the information, so we're kind of trying to diverge from typical wildlife exports. But anyway, I think an MOU would be the best way to go, but it's.
Yeah, and that has not only relevancy there, but also with all sort of monitoring of invasive species, for example, that comes into country with commodities, because you have the same issue there. So all the beetles, spiders that sits inside boxes and whatever else. So there will be a huge pile of monitoring that is going on and will increase in future to monitor.
As I say, search eDNA and any regulatory body, and it's 4 or 5 examples of how they're using it, either to be at the airports detecting what you have, using it to detect, as you were saying, invasive species, etc. So we've got to figure a way to diverge and kind of be more of, this is the information that we can provide to the regulatory agencies in cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that. But first have information and then try to address the topic. So that was the only point there.
Bill and Diane, you guys haven't gotten as far as drafting something, right?
No.
At the Smithsonian?
Nothing that nothing that can be shared with this group yet.
And then the question is, if the MOU is a useful way forward, it could also be a template outside the US to get into contact with other regulatory agencies, because in principle, the issue is the same. And so I think it might be useful to have that in mind on anything that we want to come up with. I think it's really useful and a valuable bit of information that we could use for many purposes.
Yeah, parallel would be a COSI for CITES shipments. You know, here's your COSI number, and then you're shipping it to another COSI institution.
If you know beforehand if CITES material is included, so if not, that's difficult. But on the other hand, as far as I know, internationally, at least among industrialized countries, the laws that are in place for export are to some extent harmonized. So behind there are specific concepts which have connecting points. And so also there it would be good to, if we come up with an MOU for eDNA in the US, it might have relevancy also in other countries, because you would have the same connecting points there, the same views, the same interpretations. Okay, I think we have a small group that wants to look into that.
Dirk, you can add me to the group as well.
So any more comments on that? Or things you would like to add? So I don't see anyone, then I think we should move on to the last point, or last official point. I try to be quick. That's the ongoing unfortunate Nagoya issue. Okay, that's good, Brita. There has been a very good pragmatic guidance document that has been published recently by the European Commission on what could be utilization in the sense of the Nagoya Protocol. And even though that has a tight fit to the European laws, there is a lot of taxonomic fine print in there, because the corresponding Lex and Rex group of CTEF has been actively commenting on that during the last 3 years. And the entire thing is written for normal audience. So not for lawyers, not for politicians, and not for administrative people. So that's easy language. It's easy to digest, and it has some interesting details in it, like receiving entomological collections from amateurs. What should I do? So that's really down to the basics. And I think that might be very helpful to understand obligations also outside the EU. We are happy to share the link, and I circulated that to part of the group already before in the agenda of today's meeting, but we can circulate that after the meeting as well, and might be worth to perhaps add that link or that bit of information on the
just
spinach.
put it in the chat.
Yeah, and also to maybe link that in the spinach wiki, which might be helpful there.
I can add it there as well.
Yeah. So just that bit of information. If that is interesting, or if you have any questions on that, might be worth discussing in the group. Another thing that is currently going on just now are the negotiations for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And our committee has been teaming up with the Biodiversity Crisis Committee on recent submissions and discussions that were open on the goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a wonderful opportunity to increase the visibility of taxonomy and natural history collections, because they require data for all sort of biodiversity monitoring out there. But among the items that should be monitored is also benefit sharing under the Nagoya Protocol. And especially non-monetary benefits that we already deliver. And as some negotiator put it friendly, is we are the nice to have ones. And then my response was, well, we are not only nice to have, but without taxonomy, most of your indicators will be hardly measurable, because without expertise, you don't know what you count. And so I think that is a very good opportunity for us as collections, also in our, as we are competing with academia and universities to really increase our visibility there. There is a lot of activity going on with different digitization groups, and it might be worth looking into that, how the data that is processed or gathered there could be connected immediately to those indicators and targets. Because in the past, it is always the big data aggregators that receive the credits, but the collections largely remain invisible, even though we set the baselines and offer the baseline data for all biodiversity monitoring, which is a bit unfortunate. So if you are active in digitization groups, try to link back to us, and it might be worth to connect on specific indicators and monitoring elements, and to come up with ideas how we could gather data from our side that would help us not only to increase our visibility, but also to get a better value for the work and capacity building that we do when collaborating with researchers worldwide. The next point that is currently discussed is the coverage of digital sequence information, the potential coverage of digital sequence information under the CBD or the Nagoya Protocol. There is huge political pressure on that discussion, because developing countries will require a lot of money to be able to do the post-2020 monitoring. And so they currently use the debate on DSI as a level to attract monetary benefits that help them to increase their capacities to do the monitoring. And the problem there is, there have been last year, there was a scoping study out there, how multilateral benefit sharing could work. And that had a very specific focus on collections, on the objects that we curate and store, with being as retroactive as possible. So they used data that was published from Kew from Paris that has been made available through major digitization projects. And they use these data sets to make the point that this is commercially interesting material. And so if DSI would fall under the Nagoya Protocol, that could mean that it would give foreign countries authority over those samples. And that is, for us, a very critical situation. And so we have been doing submissions last year, cautioning that this might not be a good idea. It seems at the moment that there is some sort of tendency, because of all the problems to handle DSI in databases like GenBank or EMBL, that CBD parties tend to resolve the entire issue in a rather decoupled way. So decoupled means independent of individual clicks to sequence data on GenBank, and independent how that data is used, but to ensure benefit sharing as soon as DSI is commercialized. If there would be a global obligation that makes benefit sharing an obligation, it would be for us a good opportunity to increase the visibility of non-monetary benefits that we deliver. But frankly, so we have heard a lot of hallway discussions. So at the moment, that is really thin ice. You don't want to jump and lean out of the window too much, but we try to push the entire thing towards decoupled solution, but we are not there yet. The US has some stakes in the discussion, but as a non-CBD member, not too much directly as a party, but as the US is hosting one of the major INSDC platforms, namely GenBank, the voice is heard. So it might be worth, if you have contacts with your Nagoya group, to have some sort of informal exchange, which might be helpful to understand the landscape that is there at the moment. So I think I want to leave it there. The last.
Dirk, I don't know if you heard this, but the Nagoya Protocol Action Group from the US posted some things on the forum recently, and apparently the Japanese delegation was quite happy with what we said and wants to meet. So that's something that probably will happen in the near future, that we'll get together with the Japanese to discuss this.
Yeah, there's a lot of movement behind the scenes at the moment. So this is what we noticed as well. But there are some proposals that might not be very helpful. So it is really, we need to think how we can handle use of DSI without bringing the DSI data sets itself under the CBD or the Nagoya Protocol, because that would have crucial implications with temporal and geographic scope, because genes are shared wildly among organisms, and that could just be very challenging, because at the moment there is no final definition on what DSI is, but the policy options to regulate DSI are discussed independently of that. And so if the policy option is unsuited to accommodate what DSI should finally be, that could pose major challenges. So that is the only thing we can say for the moment. but I'm happy for any sort of informal exchange in what group might be suited or not. I think we can leave it there for the moment. The last thing I want to raise is that journals are increasingly calling researchers for affirmative statements that they respect the ABS laws in the countries where they accessed their samples, and that this increasingly becomes a prerequisite to publish. So molecular ecology just recently introduced a barrier there. And also journals, especially molecular ecology, is asking authors to identify the benefits that they have shared with providing countries. And there was a similar statement from Science. And we have seen one scientific journalist of Science that repeatedly brought up cases of non-compliance. So that was the blue tarantula, for example. And there was another publication just recently on a quite colorful centipede, and that was the same guy. And he contacted CETAF beforehand, asking us, so the CETAF Lex and Rex group, if the CETAF code of conduct wouldn't apply throughout Europe. So that means for all the universities in Europe, because he wanted to make a big case. And so there is huge reputational risk out there, because people that are active there want to make a point by looking to iconic institutions which have a good name. So that maybe just as a cautionary remark, there was one case where a publication was retracted recently, because as soon as it was published, Malaysian authorities immediately contacted Francis and Taylor and said that this publication would violate the existing permits, and that the sequencing that the authors did in the field was not covered by the permits that were issued, which clearly shows that some countries are very closely monitoring publications. And it might be worth having that in mind, because I do know that many researchers are not aware of that fact, but as soon as they publish, they reach an audience, and that audience might not only be colleagues, but that audience might include authorities responsible to track and trace permit violations. And I think not only many colleagues are not aware of that fact, but also a lot of institutions as such. And the reputational risk is not for the individual researcher, but for the institution. So it might be worth discussing that. And surely, if there will be some sort of coverage of DSI, that surely will affect US collections in the course of the year as well. So I would urge US colleagues to really come up with good plans how to manage ABS, because I think that will be needed. And we are happy to, I think, announce, so if Edinburgh will take place in person, to have an ABS training next year, simply to see how to manage responsibilities. I have been in contact last year with Deborah Paul, because we wanted to join forces for the IDG workshop that wanted to look into collection management. And I think there would be a lot of opportunities in principle. What is needed is what we do, and that is knowing who did collect which samples when.
Dirk, I think we actually have to wrap it up now. So I did want to mention, if anybody that's on the call now is interested in joining our working group meetings, we do those bi-monthly, March, May, July, September, November, and we will probably be pulling together other meetings based on some of these specific topics that we discussed today. So if anybody wants to join us with those, please reach out to Dirk or me, and we'll loop you into those Zoom calls. So yeah, I think that's all the time we have, because there's another meeting coming on to this channel now. So
yeah, I think we have 5 more minutes. Is there any issue? Anyone that has anything we should do or engage? So one thing we were considering for the next spinach meeting, we want to discuss that on the council, is to be more active on training.
One other thing to think about is wiki pages, if any of these topics could benefit from having pages there.
Yeah, I hope that I have been in contact with Anja Friedrichs in Berlin, so we try to update the shipping wiki page, hopefully in summer, with all the regulatory stuff that should be filled in. Okay, there are no more questions. Then I would like to thank you very much for attending. So we had nearly 30 people, which is really nice. Thank you for your time to zoom in. And happy to catch up in one of the smaller meetings after that spinach meeting. I think that was very useful to have the smaller meetings as well, because it keeps us in regular contact, and is very useful to just meet and exchange. Okay, then let's leave it there. Thank you very much for attending.